Hello and good afternoon, everyone. My name is Erica Panato, Program and Policy Associate here at IEDC. We'd like to welcome you all to today's webinar event, Saving Retail on Main Street and Beyond. This event is part of IEDC's series on different topics related to the economic development response to COVID-19, the coronavirus. Before we get started, I would like to share a few housekeeping notes. Please note that all attendees will be muted during the webinar. You will have an opportunity to submit text questions to today's presenters by typing them into the questions pane in your control panel. You may send in your questions at any time, and we will address them during the Q&A session. Within 48 hours of today's webinar, presentation slides will be sent to all attendees. I would now like to introduce Chris Briggs, Senior Vice President at Buxton in Fort Worth, Texas. Welcome, Chris.
Thank you. Hello and welcome to the webinar. This is an installment in the International Economic Development Council's series on how economic developers and their communities are addressing the COVID-19 crisis. For the foreseeable future, IEDC will be hosting these webinars with the intent to share resources, tools, best practices, and the latest updates. Today, we are honored to welcome a group of experts from the tourism industry. Matt Wagner, Vice President of Revitalization Programs at National Mainstreet Center. Bobby Boone, Founder and Chief Strategist at And Access. And then Christopher Zimmerman, Vice President for Economic Development at Smart Growth America. We are excited to have you all join us for this important webinar. I'd like to remind our participants that you can type your questions into the Questions tab on your GoToWebinars dashboard, and representatives from IEDC will be standing by to answer them. When our presenters come to the end of the webinar, I will ask them a few questions, and we will also take questions from the audience. Also note, I'll be reading their bios in order of who is presenting. So let's get started, and let me introduce Matt Wagner. Matthew Wagner is a PhD who serves as Vice President of Revitalization Programs at the National Mainstreet Center, Inc. In this role, he is responsible for driving the center's field service initiatives, including the development and delivery of technical services for Main Street America and Urban Maine programs, directing the center's new research agenda, as well as professional development programming through the Main Street America Institute. Matt, take it away.
All right. Well, thank you so much, Chris. And I just want to thank the IEDC for hosting this afternoon, giving this opportunity to talk about a really important subject. Certainly, we've seen all across the country the dramatic impact, not only on society in general, the economy, but certainly our small mom and pop businesses all across the U.S. And I just want to first take this opportunity also do a call out to my internal colleague, Mike Poe, who's our Director of Research, who really helped out with this the survey work that I'm going to be detailing out, the research work that we did back in early April, and then a second round in May. So when COVID first, hit, when we were going through a lot of the stay-at-home orders across the U.S., we were watching a lot of the survey data that was hitting the national media, and we're immediately struck by that it tended to focus certainly on larger scale businesses, and there really wasn't a voice in what we think of as Main Street businesses, those mom and pop businesses out there. And so we felt we had a great opportunity to better understand the dynamic and how that was impacting the smallest of our small businesses out there, the real drivers of communities all across the country. And so we set out and leveraging our network across the U.S. We've got about 1,600 communities across the U.S. and we're able to do, I think, probably one of the largest national surveys of small mom and pop businesses during the COVID pandemic. And as you can see here, had about close to 6,000 small businesses that participated in this. We published a report. You can find that at our website, which is mainstreet.org. And we set this up really as a sort of longitudinal study. We felt that there was going to be a lot of changes occurring over time, and so we wanted to stick with a cohort group. And as you can see here, we had pretty wide dispersion across the U.S., and most importantly, really, driving home this not only small businesses, but also making sure that we were hitting rural communities across the U.S. as well. And so we had about more than 2,500 communities that were represented within the survey, where we had businesses responding across 48 states, including the District of Columbia. I'm going to present just a few findings from this, and then talk a little bit about sort of policy and programming that we think is important as a response to some of the survey data. One of the biggest call outs, and I think we all sort of knew this in some respects going into it, but I think how dramatic was the big aha moment for us was just how so many small businesses, again, the mom and pop Main Street businesses out there, really hadn't shifted in terms of sort of creating an omni-channel opportunity or a multi-channel opportunity with their sales. They were still primarily bricks and mortar only. And certainly what we've seen during this time period is that was not going to be an operation model set up for long-term success or getting folks through the recovery situation. So we've seen, again, 2/3 of businesses that didn't have an online sales component. I should note in this, and with those that did, it represented less than about 20% of overall sales. So even those that did have an e-commerce component, it was very, very small indeed. We also wanted to just understand more about effects, and certainly loss of revenue was one of the biggest, as you can expect, when we had such a big, shutdown across the U.S. But also just how many ended up closing altogether, having no sales during that particular time period. And then when we asked about how their business revenue had changed, a little bit more than 55% indicated a decrease by more than 75% in total revenue shifts during the month of March altogether. What was staggering when we asked about closures and employment overall, we had extrapolated at that time that we would see 7.5 million closures over the next couple months, actually bringing us to today, and about 35 million unemployed. We weren't too far off on the unemployment figures, where we're at 40 million plus. We felt at the time that would even people believe those kind of numbers, and we see how fairly accurate they've been. And on the 7.5, I've seen upwards of a total of 20 million now in terms of small businesses being impacted. Now, it's hard to better understand at this point how many will come back. Some are still remaining closed. Some are operating at a reduced sort of occupancy or level. And so I think those numbers are still yet to be seen. We also wanted to better understand, just a little bit too fast there. We also wanted to better understand what kinds of services would be most helpful at the time. And within this particular cohort group of about 6,000 businesses, we're able to actually track over time how some of the needs had shifted. And so here what you see was just immediate. This was during the PPP, the first round of PPP. And many small businesses were trying to better understand how to get access, how to work through their banks. And so that was top of mind, where some of the other technical assistance, that even though they may not have e-commerce or weren't using social media to the extent to drive delivery or pickup services, that was still sort of low in terms of how they were thinking at that particular point. And what had dramatically shifted, and what you see here, is we kept with a small cohort group that had given us their email addresses and went back out to better understand how had things changed, basically from late March, early April to early May. So basically around a 6 to 7 week period of time. And what we see here is it wasn't so much about the financials. PPP had already been through the first round. PPP number 2 had opened at that point, and what we were seeing was a little bit more concentration on e-commerce, but most importantly, this is when so many of the reopens were occurring across the U.S., and safety guidelines were the most concern here. Many of the safety guidelines, from state to state, didn't have the sort of detail, I think, where they were picking up on consumers being concerned about coming in perhaps to a restaurant, to differences between restaurants, to grocery stores, to hair salons and fitness centers, that each one of those required some sort of unique approach to safety guidelines. What we also found was that rural communities, especially rural businesses in that request, were much more likely to have received PPP. And I think, from a policy perspective, looking ahead, one of the more dramatic things around PPP, and I think why rural businesses were so much less successful, was really around banking infrastructure. If you follow the last 5 to 7 years, what we saw in banking was a tremendous amount of consolidation, and where commercial banking, commercial lending was going back, retreating out of small towns and going to regional centers. And so that really broke up some of the relationship aspects that we saw was so important, especially in the first round of PPP. Moving ahead to just some policy and programming content. One of the things that I think is so important coming out of this is that, as small businesses, trying to better understand, how to engage with PPP moving forward, how to better understand how to create safe shopping, activities within their stores or restaurants, to, putting up an e-commerce site, is that connections are so important. And I think that's the relevancy that all of us, I'm sure on this call, being, local economic development folks, chamber execs, the Mainstreet programs, et cetera, have such an important part to play in the recovery. Small businesses need access, and they need to find out how to, do these kinds of things. They're good at their businesses, but they may not understand how to set up an e-commerce site, as an example, or everything, around how to access personal protection equipment for their employees to create safe shopping. So I think having connectors, the roles that we play, are really important within this sort of recovery dynamic. I think the other big thing for small businesses is recognize partnerships. And SBDC, Small Business Development Centers, have been one of the mainstays for a lot of small businesses around the country, and we're fortunate to receive about $260 million in the CARES Act as another additional set aside. The worry here is that there's only about 1,200 small business development centers across the U.S. And when we think about the need out there, I think there's just real opportunity for, again, these partnerships to take place between chambers, Mainstreet, local economic development corporations, to be those extensions. We know that with 40 million unemployed, even if we look back at the Great Recession, that in periods of high unemployment, for example, there's generally around a year to 18-month lag, and we will see a dramatic rise in entrepreneurship. So part of this recovery and the work around small business development centers has to be around not only the recovery of existing businesses, but how are we going to be prepared to leverage an opportunity that will be made with more entrepreneurship. As part of that, we've developed, and again, this is available at our mainstreet.org site, it's really just to think about as businesses go through the recovery process, there's still not a lot of clarity out there in terms of what kinds of consumer trends we'll be taking, what was sticky and what will sort of be temporary in nature, like delivery and pickup. How much pushback will we get in terms of e-commerce relative to experiential shopping? So there are undoubtedly be business model shifts that will need to take place. And as we think about our own resources, as businesses look to then implement and execute on that, I think it's important, when we don't have a lot of clarity, to be as flexible as possible, so that when businesses are thinking about their needs, we don't have programs that are so narrowly focused that we miss the opportunity to assist them within that recovery. So just in terms of what small businesses, I think to kind of wrap up here, the small businesses, what they can be doing right now. I think first and foremost is just understand their customers. Where's the human sort of consumer psyche right now? What's going to make them more comfortable with coming back to shopping? What we've seen across the country is even though you may have a reopen proclamation, that doesn't mean consumers are going to be coming back. Even household savings rates have nearly doubled over the past 8 weeks. So people are hoarding cash, they're not out shopping, and so we need to better understand what's going to make consumers return, when will that be, and how will business models have to shift as a result of that. Certainly having more understanding of local and state guidelines. My hat's off to so many industry associations out there that I think have really been good at developing industry-specific safe shopping guidelines. To things like re-examining your own business model. You know, how are operations going to shift? Do you have new products or services? You know, do you keep delivery and pickup? How will that look? Seeking out assistance from, you know, local providers like SBDCs, but also local economic development corporations, chambers, and Mainstreet. I think, you know, we're going to have to think about execution being important. That's going to take capital. And right now, capital is probably not a resource that a lot of small businesses, especially mom and pop businesses, have on hand. So developing, you know, grant programs, loan versus loan programs that, again, are pretty much built into flexibility, as well as having other sort of alternative funding tools, I think will be critical. And then it's small businesses just being entrepreneurial. And in some ways, you're reinventing your business models. And so be thoughtful and strategic, but also nimble, be able to respond to what you're seeing with consumers, fail fast if necessary, experiment, and watch what others are doing, and then adapt to your own needs. So I'll conclude my remarks there, and we'll pick it back up with Q&A. Thank you.
And thank you, Matt. Now I would like to introduce Bobby Boone. With nearly a decade of experience immersed in retail real estate, Bobby is passionate about empowering engaged tenants, developers, and cities to create community-serving retail. He ensures the viability, and sustainability of retail environments with tailored solutions that draw on his market analysis, planning, and strategic merchandising expertise. Prior to founding And Access, Bobby led a citywide effort to attract and maintain small businesses in Detroit and tackled wide-ranging retail challenges as a senior strategist at StreetSense, from repositioning Fortune 500 brands and malls of yesteryear to crafting expansion strategies for emerging brands in commercial corridors. Bobby, welcome.
Thank you. Hello, everyone. Again, I'm Bobby Boone, founder and chief strategist at And Access. So, you know, building upon the conversation that Matt led just recently, our organization produced the Back to Brick and Mortar Guide, the guidebook to help independent retailers re-enter storefronts safely. So understanding that, hey, there's so much information out there really around how do you properly use PPE and or maintain a clean environment. However, there's so many other variables that you need to discuss. So, you know, within this guidebook that was thankfully produced by a bunch of volunteers, friends and professional colleagues who have, you know, said, hey, let's figure out how to get the businesses that are at risk most back to business safely. And so we divided this guidebook into 5 different sections, deciding to reopen, which really looks at, you know, what does it take to reopen your business after you have been closed for a period of time, not only understanding kind of state and or local protocol, but also looking at things operationally. Next, we looked at facilitating healthy business operations. So that really is, you know, looking at from a perspective of a business owner, how do you go through the next few steps? Then looking at designing a safe customer experience, understanding how your customers are engaging in your store, and then changing over into opportunities for additional sales. And then in our 4th step, we looked at training employees. And during this step, we specifically understood that, you know, many employees are faced with a very difficult decision to return, not only for their safety reasons, but also they're facing a need to understand, all right, will I make more revenue on unemployment, or will I make more revenue by serving as an employee? And where minimum wages are across the nation, that can definitely vary. Then finally, we talked about communicating with customers. As Matt mentioned previously, identifying where your customers are, how they are wanting to return back into the retail world, and what are new opportunities that can arise from that is all part of that section. I'm going to go into a few details of things I just wanted to pull out from the guidebook, but feel free to go to the website www.andaccess.com to actually download that. So in the first section, one of the things that we prioritize really is under deciding to reopen, we have to say, hey, the goal here is to survive without the need to close permanently. And so understanding that a second wave is coming, understanding that they're already strapped for cash, that they probably need additional cash reserves in order to benefit their businesses long term. How can we do that successfully? Throughout the guidebook, there are several worksheets and various other tips that the business owners can use in order to quickly identify, how are they moving forward. So within that first, section, here's one example of understanding essential functions. Essential functions for businesses really vary. However, one of the essential tips that we talked about really is how do you cross-train the employees that have the knowledge of the essential functions now, and then ensure that new opportunities arise for other employees in case they get infected, the employees that are already trained on that essential function. We also provide various calculations and other financial worksheets that can really help understand how do you get through this thing monetarily speaking. So this one is just calculating, all right, what does gross revenue look like for your business on a daily basis in comparison to what previously was true. One of my favorite sections as one that was educated in architecture and urban planning is really about the actual physical experience. So, designing a safe customer experience is one of the things that we're really honed in on here. One of the key resources that I would like to point out is the Oklahoma Department of Commerce's social distancing and sanitation resource by retail use. When you download the guidebook, feel free to just click the hyperlink, they'll automatically take you there. But what they do is they break it down by industry specific standards in order for the business owner really to understand how to navigate the situation. One way that I always, or one tool that I always refer business owners to is understanding journey mapping. So understand how your customer engaged with every single point of your business operations, and what does that provide for an opportunity to iterate on. So how do you make that experience better? And also, how do you make that experience safer? So in the example journey that's shown on this screen is really talking about a laundromat where all the points of infection or virus transfer actually can occur. So transitioning over to what does all of this really mean, changing from a conversation that's specifically business owner centric to one that is focused on economic development entities. As we are thinking about how do we prepare businesses to change their business model, one of the things is consolidating efforts for business cooperation in commercial areas. So what does that really mean? So that could vary from things such as how are businesses collaborating in terms of driving sales to one another? How can they benefit from some of their same goods and services? What is the role of a economic development entity in that? And so how, as an economic development entity, are we ensuring that we understand the entity, each of the business owners' offerings and what services they can provide to support one another. Next is defining essential operations and how they might be affected. So, talked a little bit about the pre-COVID revenue sources versus now, but it's also really understanding how, you have a role within the conversation to say, all right, there are new opportunities that you can benefit from, whether that is curbside pickup, new outdoor dining opportunities that's happening in Berkeley, et cetera, across the U.S., and then benefit the business owners from that. Next is procure locally. One of the big things I oftentimes talk about within a lot of the entrepreneurial ecosystem development work with municipalities is really, all right, what are new opportunities to realize sales for businesses, understanding that, not only during COVID, but in other times, there are challenges that business owners face in order to realize sales. And so how can the economic development entity do a buy local campaign, whether that's actually paired with an online marketplace? So, when you go to a website for your local area, you could say, oh, here are the local retailers, and here are also some goods and services that they are providing online. Joint purchasing, so arranging that. So I mentioned a little bit about cooperation in the previous slide, but this is really understanding how can two small grocers within the same community, how can they come together and realize the economies of scale that their national competitors realize on a regular basis for their stores? What are opportunities for a shared staff source to help keep up their books or maintain their contracts, et cetera? And then finally, we're looking at local providers of technical assistance services. So these providers, as through the SBDC, which has a lot of open RFPs right now for technical services consultants and or are hiring up, increasing their staff capacity in order to provide this technical assistance. How can you leverage that in order to really drive sales? So one of the challenges that I've heard from many business owners that I talk to on a regular basis is that, great, we want to figure out how to do e-commerce. However, if we actually to do that, we don't have the capacity. One, we don't have the expertise to understand how to manage both in-store and online inventory without, selling one product in one place while it's also being sold in another. Also, how do you, deal with shipping and handling and packaging, all of the things that many brick and mortar businesses do not have to deal with. So understanding if you could, as an economic development entity, benefit from some of those technical assistance services in a very strategic manner. Yes, many businesses, have a very wide range. However, if you have specific people with a expertise in one area, and then you can kind of create a suite of services based upon that. Next, looking at omni-channel sales. I think I'm not going to go on this for too long because we've talked about it many times. But one of the things that I really want to push here is that the permit process that's typically accompanies the curbside pickups and or sidewalk cafes is one oftentimes hidden from many entrepreneurs. They don't really understand how to access those programs. They don't have the time to make the application or go up to the permit office. How are we ensuring that those processes are more streamlined, as well as they are truly designed in order to have the greatest benefit, understanding that this is now not only an amenity to the business, but also a public health instance. Also, understand that these businesses that formerly relied solely on foot traffic, they have to also realize who their customer is. So building on the technical assistance step that was mentioned previously, how can businesses now understand, all right, my customer was always an incidental customer walking in on the street. I didn't ever keep any data about that customer typology, but now I want to figure out how to attract even a larger customer base. And so that customer base not only exists in a local capacity, but also maybe a national one if they're expanding their business operations into a more online national delivery-based model. Next, peer data. So this is what's really tricky. Many economic development entities have established some loan programs which have collected, a bunch of data on what the state of businesses was prior to COVID and how they have been impacted thus far. There's an opportunity to continue monitoring some of the business success through those relationships of the lendees. So how do you reach out to them, ask them, hey, what's going on with your business? How can we kind of anonymize that data over the district or city, et cetera, in order to really maintain a pulse of, oh, this is what's happening. One of my favorite resources that I found recently is the Google mobility data. That data really provides a pulse on a countywide geographic scale of how people are actually moving. So that how they're moving to grocery store, how they're moving to other retail that has closed on most commonly across the nation, how they're going to parks, et cetera. So understanding that that is a data source that you can at least start to benchmark, all right, as mobility is increasing, that likely means sales are increasing specifically into those retail categories. Then finally, I want to talk a little bit about preserving businesses. You all might be aware that CDBG funds, community development block grants, have additional pool of money has been released there. One thing that the new pool of money has provided is how can you get short-term working capital assistance for these small businesses? So specifically for the retention of jobs held by low and moderate income persons. So that's really key in some of the rural areas as well as some of the underserved communities where many of these establishments are employing the many at-risk residents, and so ensuring that CDBG is not only providing for an opportunity to decrease blight, which is this initial understanding, but also to provide a workforce component. And then the second one, which I think is really essential as we're looking through next steps for small businesses, specifically restaurant small businesses. This is establish, stabilize, and expand micro enterprises, and that's around food delivery, among other things in that clause. However, for food delivery, you have to just realize, how can existing businesses provide the delivery service themselves if they are using a third party such as Uber Eats, DoorDash, et cetera. What does that mean for their bottom line? Because a lot of those purveyors require you to keep the price the same that it is in store, as well as they take a percentage of that revenue. So at the end of the day, you're receiving less revenue than you would otherwise as that business owner. So as new micro enterprises establish that provide that service, there might be some new insightful opportunities to circumvent some of those challenges. So that's something that many economic development entities will have to go and talk to whomever the HUD administrator is in their municipality, whether that is at the local planning or housing department, et cetera. And then looking forward, one of the things I really want to talk about is what are the next steps? I think Chris in our next presentation is really going to talk about this activating place in new ways to drive sales. But wanted to also talk through, what are the continued sales opportunities for small businesses? So how can you continue to realize those sales as an economic development entity, whether that is purchasing as a department, encouraging the corporations, which, the economic development entity might also serve to have additional purchasing opportunities, et cetera. Next is the risk of vacancy. As we know, many of the moratoriums that were levied specifically for, rent or mortgage payments are coming due, and there's still a lot of unclarity about what is next. How can the business owner sustain if they are unable to pay their rent? And specifically considering that occupancy standards are lower in most parts of the nation, and so they aren't able to, seat the 150 people in their restaurant that they typically do at their peak periods. Instead, they're at 50%, some as low as 20% of that entire occupancy. And so, what does that mean for their payments? So, thinking about what's happening under the back end is understanding that many investment funds are now mobilizing in order to understand, all right, what are opportunities to gain additional property? And so as you all are stewards of the businesses, or stewards of the real estate, et cetera, how are you communicating opportunities for community ownership, for ensuring that these businesses will be under a property owner who has their interests at best in heart? And if the transfer of property ownership actually does occur, what are the tools that you are using, such as incentives and abatements, to encourage that activity or discourage the activity that's based upon the goals that your organization has for the business community, speaking of the smaller retailers. And then finally, thinking about alternative lending tools. For property owners who may want to, maintain their tenant, to, figure out how to deal with their debt, another way, is there a role that the economic development entity plays in order to create a new revolving loan fund, perhaps, in order to say, hey, let's restructure debt that's at the property owner level in order to enable them to have additional patient capital, to right size, I would say, their lease rates depending on where the market goes within the next few months, and then to maybe have additional opportunities for sustained tenanting and really changing that risk of vacancy over time. So with that, I thank you for listening in and look forward to the conversation.
Bobby, thank you very much. Appreciate that. Now let me introduce Chris Zimmerman. Christopher Zimmerman is Smart Growth America's Vice President for Economic Development and Director of the Governor's Institute on Community Design. An economist by training, Chris heads the team which provides quantitative analysis for data-driven policy recommendations, such as modeling the fiscal impact of development patterns or quantifying potential loss of affordable housing from rising real estate values. He leads SGA's Technical Assistance Program for Equitable Transit-Oriented Development, you'll hear that as ETOD, and oversees the Downtown Revitalization Program, which provides training and technical assistance to local officials across the country. Chris, welcome.
Thank you. So I'm going to probably underscore some things that Bobby and Matt have said. The main thing, I guess, to start with is that we, of course, need to remember that before there was a pandemic, there was dramatic change going on in the retail sector, and that the changes that have affected our economy in the last several decades, which are far-reaching in so many ways, were particularly impactful on the retail side. The knowledge economy has been driving essentially the economy, taking over from what was a manufacturing economy, and that has had a number of consequences, including making economic development at the local level a lot about placemaking. on the whole, of course, retail has had a rough go, particularly since the Great Recession, which in particular affected the suburban auto-based shopping model, which had dominated so much for the second half of the 20th century, from drive-in strip shopping centers ultimately to the enclosed climate-controlled shopping malls that had a great run, and then big box power centers. But of course, the success of those models was based upon and very much tied to the car-centered lifestyle of the American suburb. And like everything else in that, its retail component became overbuilt by the onset of the recession a little over a decade ago. And at the same time, of course, that was happening, then e-commerce came in. So the big boxes kind of undermined the shopping mall, and then Amazon came in and pulled the pins out from under them to increase in degree, and the big outfits like Walmart and others they're trying to compete on the other side, right? So but fundamentally, if your appeal is about delivering a wide array of goods as cheaply as possible, then it's not surprising that ultimately online shopping is going to overtake a lot of the drive-to alternative. But in recent years, what that's meant was that for many, it seemed clear that the future of any kind of bricks and mortar retail would be increasingly about experiential retail. People do really like to go out and shop. The internet's fine for acquiring goods. If it's cheap and they deliver my purchases to my house, why not? I don't have to drive. I don't have to pay the gas. I don't have to park in the lot, walk across the lot, carrying everything back to my car and all that sort of thing. But the thing is, I still want to get out. I still want to browse in 3 dimensions. I want to see people. I want to combine different sets of tasks and have a variety of experiences, pick up this or that, look for some potential gifts, stop for lunch or coffee, see a movie, play a concert, take in the sounds of buskers on the street, all the things we experience that the World Wide Web doesn't quite substitute for. And that's where Main Street really comes in. And from big cities to small towns, Main Streets, of course, have enjoyed quite a resurgence in recent years. And as I said, all of this has made economic development really dependent upon placemaking. And communities need to have a good placemaking strategy in order to compete in this environment. This is all obviously, prior to what's happened since March. But clearly, COVID is a threat to this for all the reasons stated before and shown pretty dramatically in the results of Matt's survey. This is a challenge. But from the small places where main streets have come back, to more big metropolitan area, suburban places that have created new environments that are based on this, this experiential retail approach. We've seen success for a lot of reasons that are pinned in the changing economics and demographics that are still underway, that are still very much a factor and will be after this situation passes. Even the big guys like Walmart, in fact, had to get into the on-street retail business as a result. But the point is that we really do depend upon retail as a component of this, and it's it's not just about retail narrowly defined, but retail is a big part of it. And so whether it's old-fashioned streets or new ones newly created, we are really dependent upon this to the point where this is one of the issues in a time when retail has been hard, and there are retail vacancies. Before we had this situation, what do you do about that? And a lot of thinking has to go into how we make retail successful, and also how we define retail, and what we do to make up for the difference if there's not going to be quite as much need for that space. But again, I do think the need for the space and the demand for the space is going to be in the place where there are experiences, which at the moment are hard to come by given the restrictions under the pandemic. But nonetheless, all the trends, all the things that have been happening, they're still underway. And as people return to something closer to normal life, this is going to continue to be a factor. I think maybe this froze. I don't know if somebody can help me with the advance this, but it seems to have gotten stuck. In any case, we've the last several years done a lot of work looking at how this new recipe for economic development has been used around the country. and seen a lot of places with the success of it. But this is clearly threatened now with the situation we're in now, not just in the short term, but obviously for all the reasons that have to do with the question about where we're going to go from here and how you come out of this and who survives. There is a risk that we wind up with just more and more consolidation. So for instance, retail spaces could become occupied, but all picked up by kind of the large businesses, the national chain retailers, and nothing against them, but the whole strategy about placemaking does depend a lot upon authenticity, and that the local smaller businesses are the ones that provide that. So it's vital for them to survive if we're going to continue to see the success that places have been able to have in the last couple of decades. And to do that, I think the question is then, what is to be done? What can you do in the near term, and what can you do as we move through transition to whatever follows? One question, of course, is how long is the short term? And we don't know that now. As we move out of actual lockdown and to something that is sort of in between lockdown and normal, there are going to be a need for a whole range of things. And Bobby talked about some of those specifics. That I think suggest some of what we need to look at. So let me move. If we can move ahead here now. Let's just go ahead a couple of slides. Go to like 9, if you can. In any case, so the question for particularly people working at the local level, I think, and I mean whether you're a city council member or involved in an economic development agency, in all the various ways in which policy is made at the local level, you've got to look at, next slide, please. You've got to be looking at things that are related to some of what Bobby was talking about specifically. So permitting and regulation, the ways we've done things, these are issues, again, prior to pandemic, but they now may have a really critical impact in the ability of smaller retails to adapt and survive. Local governments need to be aggressive in addressing these. So facilitating outdoor seating for restaurants is a good example, but also setting up space for delivery and pickup options, if that's the way we've got to function. Doing creative things in general with public space to support adjacent businesses, which in many cases means looking at turning street space from vehicular exclusive use, just cars and trucks, to people space, because that can become even more important now in adjacent businesses being able to get ahead. So some of this is long-term things that needed to happen anyway, and some of it are things that need to be addressed very quickly, and in some places have been. But that's a lot of a review of existing practices that is, I think, suddenly accelerated and made more urgent as a result of the situation we're in now. Now there is the question about, what about just having them survive? How do they survive? And direct aid to small business is going to continue to be a question. I think it's always been a hard thing to figure out how to do, and then Congress sort of decided to do it with the PPP, and I think there'll be a lot of work over time to assess what worked and what didn't, how well that worked. But some of that is clearly going to be necessary, and I think continue to be necessary. I thought it was interesting because that's at the federal level, but what can you do at the local level? And there are some efforts. This one happens to be in the community I live in Arlington, Virginia, and they basically put together some of the federal money with some local money and created a grant program that a week or so ago announced that about 400 businesses in the community are going to be receiving these. So this is at least an indication of the level of concern at the municipal level for the survival of small local business, because this is not the kind of thing that local governments have typically done a lot of, certainly not in this community, this subject community here. Service to local governments, local businesses has been more informational. It's an ombudsman kind of thing, but not direct aid. And so that obviously underscores the extent of the crisis. So they're going to be, distributing to a range of different kind of businesses. You'll notice that a lot of them are in restaurant and food services, but it's a range of smaller businesses, many of which are really involved in this experiential economy, which this particular community, like so many others, depends heavily upon. So you see everything from arts and entertainment to food services and so on, and as well as generalized retail. Will we see more of this? We may need to. Does it need to be targeted? Probably. And there are other issues, and I just want to close with a couple of things for people to think about. One of them is this big thing out there, opportunity zones, which is potentially a massive amount of capital, and as it's been sort of playing out over the last 2 years. Up before the pandemic, it wasn't clear if it was even attracting as much capital as had been expected. It does seem to have done well in the pandemic in those terms. But then there's a question of where it's going. And I know there was a very interesting piece done by the Urban Institute that was in the news in the last week. We're all in the middle of some of our own research on this subject. And it isn't clear. It seems every indication is that the money's mostly gone into real estate as opposed to going to businesses, which is one question. So the question I'm raising is, are there ways, particularly if people are talking about amending or doing something with the Opportunity Zone program, if it can be called that, that might potentially play into this and provide some support for retail and other small businesses around the country? And then, of course, there's the big equity issue that we're confronted with so much, particularly at the moment, and the question about how this plays out. Because again, the most vulnerable are the smallest, and the most vulnerable will be minority-owned businesses. And when we're done with this, again, if what we wind up with is a consolidation to large entities, then the effects will be disproportionate across our society. And that's another dimension that really needs to be thought about carefully as we move forward into whatever the world looks like in the next phase. So with that, I will stop and turn it back to Matt and look forward to discussion and questions. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Chris. Appreciate that. So to the audience, I'm going to let you know that we are going to move into a discussion phase and be taking some questions. And a reminder that you can submit those questions through your GoToWebinar portal. I would also like to remind everybody, because this question's come up, you will be within 48 hours receiving the slides from today, and that came up a couple of times. Let's start with a couple of questions here. If I've got everybody on board there, I'll start with Matt, because you've been quiet a while because you went first, and give both Chris and Bobby a chance to catch their breath. Matt, one of the things that I've noticed, last week, I believe it was, we got the news on the retail front that at a national level, obviously things change market to market, region to region, but that we saw in May an increase, maybe a little bit more aggressive increase in retail sales that have been lost, outpacing what projections were. I think we were up to about 18% or so increase month over month, and obviously April was at the bottom of that, so we haven't climbed all the way back. But interested in your perspective and how that's translating at the Mainstreet level with local retailers and businesses, and others feel free to jump in as well.
Yeah, so I think it's a combination of things. One, a little bit of exuberance from people coming out of their homes and wanting to get out and be active, especially perhaps in the more entertainment front, bars, restaurants. Especially in the seasonal areas where you could get out and do some outdoor dining. To Chris's point around placemaking, we see a lot of sort of reclaiming streets, open streets to allow for social distancing while dining. But I think it's still rather spotty. I meant, not all closures were sort of the same across the country. Some were more impacted than others, especially in rural communities. So I think it's hard to tell at this point because there's just so much lack of clarity around, is there going to be a second wave? We're certainly seeing upticks in some areas that reopen fairly aggressively, and we'll have to require some pullback. So I think it's still early to tell. And monthly data without having some longer term data to look at, I think it's hard to make judgments at this point.
Bobby or Chris, anything you'd want to add to that response? All right. Well, let me, you mentioned restaurants having the opportunity to open up, and I think everybody kind of hit on this a little bit. And I might divide this question up between Chris and Bobby, and Bobby maybe from an operator standpoint and a customer experience standpoint, and then Chris also from a placemaking standpoint, and maybe what cities and economic development organizations are doing or can be doing. Restaurants account for so many of the businesses we're talking about on main streets and so many of the mom and pop businesses that are out there. And Matt just mentioned that ability to move toward outside dining. What are some keys, if you don't mind underscoring those again? I know you hit on it, both of you did, but we got a little time to maybe go into a little more detail. What are some keys for an operator to get that type of expansion? And maybe talk a little bit more about how an economic development organization or a municipality can help facilitate that.
Bobby, you want to start?
I can start. Let me actually switch out if my headphones are dying. Alrighty. So one of the things that I think should be stated up front is that the ability to go out into public space varies. That isn't like homogenous. Everybody doesn't have 12, 16 feet sidewalks and or road that can be closed or that the municipality is willing to be closed. On another leg, it's looking at the conversation from every district or every retailer is not under the auspices of a place management organization, whether that's a Main Street or a business improvement district, that a lot of times really can push these initiatives in terms of how to effectively use public space forward, and as such end up with fewer opportunities for sales. And so when we're thinking about the actual implementation of a public space initiative for a restaurateur in say an underserved community, not a place management organization, et cetera, that's who we should design for. And so that is, how do we design a system in which they can maybe even be automatically approved, or representatives from the planning and economic development or public works department can come and say, hey, here are 3 options that you can choose from. Are you interested in doing either of these? So removing the burden from the actual operator during this time, I think, is one of the key equity issues in order to really ensure businesses, regardless of their location, can survive. 2, I think when it comes to looking at the actual business owners within the what they need to consider, that is outdoor seating, of course, is different than indoor seating. So do they have the appropriate furniture, fixtures, and equipment that's associated with outdoor dining? And can they effectively manage kind of getting meals from the kitchen, back of house mostly, so all the way near the alley, maybe all the way into the middle of the street, without necessarily having too many additional issues, risk of virus transfer being probably among the top. So are there clear passageways from at the threshold of the building, so people don't actually have to touch doors with plates, et cetera, and who's handling all of that at that time? And think there's a whole nother conversation that could be had about the actual staff training and what do they need to accomplish in order to be successful in this. However, given the limitations on time, I won't go into that detail.
Chris, anything you'd add to that?
Yeah, well, I think I really just want to underscore a couple things Bobby said. Bobby mentioned place management, which is really important, and I probably should have said earlier. I think places that have place management organizations are going to be in better shape for a number of different reasons. And of course, the whole point about removing the burden from the from the entrepreneurs, from the people who have to operate the businesses, is what we need to be aiming our efforts. I'd say that the challenge is that we're really to really make a difference, we need a fairly comprehensive re-engineering of two things. Basically, we need to re-engineer the processes that are otherwise, somewhat automatic, deeply ingrained, may be functional, may not be functional. It varies a lot from place to place. But lots of well-meaning people are involved in systems that have done things a certain way for a long time, and there were good reasons they were set up that way, but they may really need to be rethought about how it works you get from, the front of door when you walk into City Hall till you leave with a permit for something. And process reengineering takes a look from above. People in the system can't fix it. So it takes the people who are in leadership to be able to say, okay, this is a messy thing, but we've got to work this out and sort it out. It can be done, but it really takes leadership. And the other kind of reengineering, which is equally murky, is the more physical kind. As I think we look at places where, the places we most depend upon for this activity, where we're generating the most value, which is typically in walkable places, because that's the commercial value of walkable places has been soaring well ahead of everything else for some time now. And we need to look at those places and say, from building phase to building phase, what do we need to do differently to make this thing work? And it's not simply that the simple way this happens is, we have a quick look to see how we can get more tables out onto the sidewalk and permit that, and that's fine. But a longer term, and by longer term, I maybe even mean midterm. In other words, it's not just weeks, but maybe it's months, maybe it's a longer term, because we don't know how long we're going to be in kind of an in-between stage. We really should be looking at how do we make the entire public space, from the nexus with private space, that is building space to building space, a place people want to be and can safely enjoy, and will go there to do business. And that means not segmenting it into, well, this part is for the through traffic in between, and everything else has to go on in whatever margin is left. We really need to then get serious about saying some of these things, some of these places can be converted into larger public spaces where we're devoting less space to vehicular movement and more space for people to be, because they need to be outdoors, because the indication is that that's actually safe for all kinds of reasons. And really rethinking that. But again, normally somebody's in charge of the sidewalk is not the person who's in charge of the middle of the street, and who has the authority to say, look, we're gonna relook at this and rethink that, and that's gonna take leadership.
Thank you, Chris. So Matt, I'm going to shift gears over to you. We talked a little bit about the capital access issues that face rural communities more so than suburban, urban communities, because of the consolidation of the banking industry and those relationships. Aside from that, and we got quite a few questions here about rural communities, just not surviving but thriving. Anything you want to double back on or underscore for those in the audience that are working in rural communities?
Yeah, I think a couple things. One, I'm very hopeful in terms of where potential opportunities might be. When we think about previous trends that were occurring, pre-COVID, and then generally being accelerated during the pandemic, certainly remote work is one of those areas. And as we think again about the importance of placemaking, creating livable places, rural communities, I think, have tremendous opportunity if we can work through some infrastructure policy issues. A little bit on the housing diversity as well is key. But the ability to think about the attraction of remote workers and talent that doesn't need to be work-based I think is a tremendous opportunity as we look forward. And then I think we'll also need to think about programmatically again financing tools, and that because of bank consolidation pull away from rural communities on the commercial lending, commercial banking side, that's been an area that just hasn't. I don't think we've seen enough efforts there, especially in perhaps in terms of like rural CDFIs. Rural LISC is a great opportunity that through their Kiva trustee program. But I think we have to think about alternative resources that can be scaled appropriately for rural economies as well.
And Chris, you had mentioned some of the even Arlington, Virginia, not a rural community, but the program that they had for local businesses. You seen anything that translates at a more rural level, something similar to that, or regionally for rural communities?
Well, I have to say that I'm really interested to be able to find out what other places are doing any kind of direct assistance program like that, because I think that is interesting. And I don't know that there's a source at this time. I found out about this one because I happen to live here. And I've sort of been poking around. I've heard, some indications of a number of places doing some kind of direct aid, but I've not seen a comprehensive source of that. Obviously, it's in a lot of the rural communities where I do a lot of my work, in my job, they are often challenged. They wouldn't necessarily have the same resources to start with. They may be doing similar pass-through things, using or leveraging part of the federal money. I would like to see somebody survey that. Because I don't really have a handle on it.
All right, fair enough. Good. There's a lot to kind of learn in the flow of this. It's such a unique time that we're all living through. I guess it's happening to everybody across industries and across all cities. So there's a lot of labs to learn in. Bobby, got a question for you, and you were talking about some of the things you were talking about really perked my ears. You were speaking my language. Buxton is a consumer analytics firm, and we work with a number of communities and retail businesses, but a number of communities to help them, empower them with localized data on who their consumers are and how they're behaving. But a question that came up was around some of that mobility data you talked about. I believe you were referencing Google's data. I know that our firm provides that level of data, but what are some other resources, if you're aware of any, that our audience can take into consideration here?
Oh, wow. I think it really relies on what the actual need is. One of the things that I try to do is be very intentional with the resources. And so, I'll talk a little bit more about Google, and then we could talk how to find new innovative solutions depending on your problem. Maybe that'll be a better conversation from my perspective. But Google mobility reports are, they just were released starting, I think, in late March. That tracks from February 29th. And uses year-over-year mobility data, so you can kind of get a perspective of what's happening in your community as it relates to what happened the same day of last year, over a 5-year period, really. And so they use the average for that. So that information, again, is really just to understand how people are moving around and what that could be, if that could be correlated to actual retail sales. That's to be determined. Second is, looking specifically at, how do you address challenges and then determine what data solutions are best? I think, given where we are with COVID, it's very difficult to find the real, highly accurate data sources outside of things that are using, mobility data, or if you have consolidated, say, point of sale systems for your retail district that you're managing, or something else where you could say, hey, everybody's using Toast, for example, and now I can run metrics off of that, at least for my small businesses. That really then requires a conversation around what data am I collecting as an entity. So piggybacking off of all right, we maybe establish some loan programs, or second, we may have, been in touch with these businesses historically, but how can we leverage that historic data in order to move forward? That I think really relies on a great relationship between the business owner and whatever entity is collecting the data, for both instances of like, hey, am I trusting you with my data? Because a lot of business owners are very skeptical of, what that looks like. Say, hey, my revenue decreased from 100,000, to $20,000. That's some very vulnerable information that typically isn't shared. And so coming up with, who is delivering the message or who is requesting the data from the business owners, and then how can you leverage that information for future policy programs or systems design?
Thank you, Bobby. All right, Chris, I think I got another question for you here. Going to talk Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania. Had some interest here in understanding what were the attributes that got a Rust Belt city like Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania added to the smart growth list.
Well, in fact, they were really at the front end, I would say, of cities in America, kind of reemerging and taking advantage of the assets that they had to reposition themselves. Of obviously, the decline of the steel industry in particular had quite an impact, and they had a lot of population loss in the 70s and 80s. But they early on built on the things they had to make a livable city and to make it very attractive to people who, might have come from somewhere else. It's in particular great public spaces, good public transportation, which they maintained, and when a lot of other places, had lost it, they still had it, so they've continued to enhance that. But they have great neighborhoods that are nearby, adjacent to or not far from the job centers, and that compactness and adjacency is a great advantage. They had essentially the bones and structure for a walkable place, because that's the way we built places before 1950, and so Pittsburgh kind of had that in place and did a lot to enhance all that. In recent years, in particular, they've done so much work with mobility in general, bicycle lanes. I mean, you think of it as a hilly place, which it is, but they've demonstrated that topography does not necessarily limit people's interest in or willingness to bicycle. A lot of it really has to do with the infrastructure being provided. And so, they've become a place that has all these qualities that people are more and more looking for, particularly the somewhat younger generation than me. And they've leveraged that very effectively, so that now, while they don't have a steel industry, they did have, eds and meds, health and education, and they've now moved to being a place that has a lot of the most dynamic industries, including software development. You've got some, major high-tech companies there now. So they're a good example of a place that, has become attractive to the workforce, and that workforce is key in attracting and generating economic development opportunity.
Very good. Thank you. Let's take a look at, okay, so want to provide for both the panel, because I think this was a question we had, interested in some resources and maybe some reference programs that we could go look at. We have a viewer provides that Skagit County, Washington, and many of the cities and towns within that county are doing, according to this listener, small business grant programs to supplement what their governor was able to do. So that might be something for us on the panel, and also the listeners today, participants, to take a look at. Give me just one moment here. I want to see what else we have. So Chris Zimmerman, any question came in directly for you. Are there any best practices for attracting businesses and real estate investment to opportunity zones, particularly post-COVID? You did mention that you've seen an increase in activity there with OZs. So that question has sparked some interest. So again, any best practices for attracting business and real estate investment in opportunity zones post-COVID?
Yeah, I'm not sure we've figured that out yet. And I have to say that I think the answer to it, particularly post-COVID, will depend a lot on what the policy response is to current issues. Meaning, I think that there are going to be some changes made to the program, and that will greatly affect, what's a good strategy. My impression from what I've seen in the work we've done is that the opportunity zone money is kind of going where you'd expect money to go, which is to say where there's a high rate of return. There's some 9,000 something opportunity zones designated around the country, but a very small percentage of them have most of the value. And we thought going in that we're going to see most of the money go to those places, which look a lot like the places that have attracted, on a national level, have attracted most of the big investment over the last decade or two anyway. So we worked with a lot of rural communities that have opportunity zones, but that doesn't mean they're going to attract the investment. It's ultimately about return on investment for whoever's putting the money in, and there isn't anything in the as it's drafted now, as the statute exists, there isn't much to steer it one way or the other. So uh, I think the question is, are we going to see a number of reforms that have been kicking around that will then change that and create a different environment for whatever strategy you want to use to go to something. That's partly geographic. Where are they going? And it's partly the nature of the investment, because they do seem to be mostly going to real estate. And that's one where although the pandemic has led, I think, to more money going into opportunity zones from the indications I've seen, that doesn't necessarily mean they're less likely to go. They're more likely to go to business, because those are, number one, generally going to be riskier investments, and number two, not as easy to put together, on a portfolio basis. So when you look at the kind of venture capital that goes into businesses, they tend to be looking for things that will scale big, and that's not necessarily small business. Um, so I think that the best practices really have to be invented, which is to say, I think there needs to be an element of policy reform here, combined with a goal, with the intentionality that we're going to channel some of this to this purpose. To me, that's the best practice. It needs to be exercised by the people who have the authority of it, which ultimately is federal lawmakers at this point, to refine it so that, number one, there's a location efficiency component, so that whether you're going to a big city or a rural area, you're actually putting it in the right place. And that probably means not building another hotel by a highway that probably would have gotten it anyway. And it means having an equity component, so it's actually going to places that need it, and to people who need to receive it, and something that helps facilitate the creation of funds that would support businesses, but especially that would support a range of smaller businesses in a large portfolio. Because that's the thing, is to make this work, you're going to have to put a whole lot of stuff together. And that, I don't think, has been worth it for too many people playing in this space up to now, because the numbers just don't work that way. But with some guidance and changes to the nature of the federal legislation, I think that might be possible.
All right, interesting. All right, so from our attendees, kind of under the theme of we're all in this together and learning as we go, a couple of more resources being pushed out here. One mentions that the USDA has grants for businesses in rural areas. And then we've got somebody from my backyard, I don't know this person, but says that the North Texas area, so I think the Dallas-Fort Worth area, is most of the cities and counties in that region have set up small business grants utilizing the CARES Act dollars. And I'm sure that's something that has been replicated as well across the country in some markets. Very good. Looks like we have just about hit the bottom of our questions here and are also nearing the end of our time. So let me just take this opportunity to remind everybody once again, attendees, you will be receiving a recording of this within the next 48 hours. You'll get the slides and the recording. The other thing I would say is a reminder, this is from our friends at IEDC, ongoing series they have helping economic developers and municipalities understand the COVID-19 impacts and how to manage through this crisis, not just to survive, but to thrive. I would like to have a big thank you, and I've learned a ton from our panelists today. So once again, Matt Wagner, Vice President of Revitalization Programs at National Mainstreet Center. Thank you very much, Matt, for your participation. Great content today, great resource.
Thank you.
Bobby, yeah, you bet. And also very nice to meet you. And Bobby Boone, Founder and Chief Strategist and Access. Bobby, thank you so much. Great job, great information today. And Christopher you bet, Bobby. And Christopher Zimmerman, finally there, Vice President for Economic Development, Smart Growth America. Chris, thank you so much. Great information there and discussion from all of you.
My pleasure. Thank you.
You bet. And my name is Chris Briggs, Senior Vice President at Buxton Company, and want to just once again appreciate IEDC for hosting this, using their platform to share information with their members, and just a valuable resource. And want to thank everybody in attendance, and just remind everybody that, yeah, we are all in this together, and sharing our resources, sharing our information is the way we're all going to pull through. So thank you very much. Y'all have a great week and keep doing good work. Thank you.